All right, who can tell me what we talked about last month? Last month. I'll ask you about last week in a minute, but I want to know about last month. That was 2 months ago, but good job. Tough love? I don't think so. That was 3 months ago. It was a 3-week series. The picture on the screen of the background was you guys. Difference makers, right? We talked about being a difference maker. We talked about, week 1, we talked about letting our convictions determine our direction, not comfort, right? We talked about if we're going to be a difference maker in the world for Christ, then we've got to be willing to be led by our convictions and not by comfort. Week 2, we talked about how all of us belong to the body of Christ, the church. We all belong, we all have a purpose, right? We talked about how the body of Christ has a nose, it has hands, it has feet, and they all serve a purpose. And if they're cut off, then they don't no longer serve a purpose, right? And so we all belong. We all have spiritual gifts. Why do you have food in here? Why do you have food in here? Water only, bro. Week 3, we talked about mentoring, right? Mentors, discipleship, right? What does it mean? What is a mentor? Someone who guides you. But when we talk about biblical mentoring, we're talking about discipleship. We're talking about have someone older in your life that's of the same gender, that's a little bit farther along in life, that can speak into you, help you develop as a leader, help you develop as a follower of Christ, help you develop as a person, right? One of the hardest things to do is to go up to someone, because I did this past week, but it's to go up to someone and say, hey, I have a question for you, okay? What's it like to be on the other side of me? Because when you ask someone that question, you don't know what you're going to get. And you've got to be willing to have the heart to receive that, because you might get something negative. Matter of fact, probably more often than not, you're going to get something negative than positive, because most people tend to focus on the negative about someone rather than the positive. But we need mentors in our life to help us show us blind spots, to help guide us, help direct us through this life. And so if you don't have a mentor, you need to find a mentor, right? And I'm talking from a biblical perspective. I'm not talking about someone who you work out with or someone you play football with. Not necessarily. I'm talking about someone a little bit farther along in life, the next season of life. You know, Luke could be a great mentor for a junior high boy. He could be a great mentor for a junior high boy. But here's the deal, right? You need a mentor. So find one if you don't have one. Last week, what did Miss Julie talk about? For those of you that were here. Okay, that was the start of the message. Yep. It's in 1 Timothy 4:12. It says, let no one despise you because of your youth, but instead set an example in what? Conduct, speech, faith, love, purity. That sounds right. Yeah, sure. I don't have it exactly memorized. Yes. Yes, yeah. So then she talked about how just because you're young doesn't mean you can use that as an excuse to act a certain way. And you need to think about how you act as well as how you act online. Because the digital footprint that you leave will always be there. The decisions that you make online will always be there, right? And that's what she talked about. Tonight, we're not starting a new series necessarily, because we got a couple weeks of one-off messages, and then in June and July, we're going to have some guest speakers. I'm super excited for that. We got a lot of youth groups in the area that don't meet during the summer, so I'm going to steal some of those youth pastors to come speak to you guys. I got a friend from Ohio who's going to come here and speak. So I'm excited to have some of these different voices speaking into your life, leading into camp, where you're going to hear another different voice, right? We're getting really close to camp. Those of you going on the missions trip, we're getting really close to the missions trip, but most of y'all are, who's signed up for camp? Wow, that's awesome. I think most of you have raised your hands. That's awesome. That's all right. So camp is coming. It's going to be great. But tonight what I want to talk about is greatness. I want to talk about greatness, and I hope you're taking notes. I hope you guys come ready to learn with ears leaning forward to ready to hear the message that God has for you. This message tonight is something that just kind of came into my head out of nowhere. So it's not like it's just nothing. It's not a bit. It is a big deal, but it's not like, whew, right? So greatness. What is greatness? The GOAT, the greatest of all time. Who is the GOAT? Jesus. Come on, people. Jesus. Jesus is the GOAT. Now, when it comes to basketball, Michael Jordan. Any of you LeBron fans can peace out. So here's the deal. Greatness is being great at something, right? When I say greatness, you guys immediately go to thinking about athletes. But greatness is a quality that most of us in here want in our life. How many of you guys want to be liked? Like you want people to like you and hang out with you, right? Most of us, right? Right? How many of you guys want people to care about you? How many of you guys want people to talk to you? How many of you guys want people to think that you're like the greatest at whatever you do? Right? That's most of us. Most of us in this life. Hey, listen, Zach wants to be really good at musical chairs of death. He wants to be really good at it. He wants to be the GOAT at musical chairs of death, right? The thing is, most of us in here have a competitive spirit, right? That competitive spirit leads you towards greatness, right? That's part of it. But we need to learn how greatness begins, where it's going, and how to achieve it, right? Because we all want to be the GOATs. We all want to be the greatest of all time at something. I want to be the greatest youth pastor of all time. I want to be the greatest dad of all time. I want to be the greatest husband of all time. I want to be the greatest grandpa someday of all time, right? Like, someday, a long time from now, right? But I want to be great at what I do. It's what drives me. Because I want to be, does that mean I'm perfect? By no means. But it does mean that I try, right? So here's the deal. To be great, there was these people in the Bible called the disciples. You guys remember those? Anybody know any of their names? Peter. The first four Gospels? Jeremiah was not a disciple. Peter? All right, that's good. So in Mark chapter 9 is the Bible text that we're going to be in. I noticed most of you guys, man, y'all need to bring your Bibles and your notebooks to church.
I thought we were doing small groups.
We are, later, after the message. That's how it always goes. Mark chapter 9, I'm going to read it. Leaving that region, they traveled through Galilee. Jesus didn't want anyone to know that he was there, for he wanted to spend more time with his disciples and teach them. He said to them, "The Son of Man is going to be betrayed into the hands of his enemies. He will be killed, but 3 days later he will rise from the dead." They didn't understand what he was saying, however, and they were afraid to ask him what he meant. After they arrived at Capernaum and settled in a house, Jesus asked his disciples, "What were you discussing out on the road?" But they didn't answer, because they had been arguing about which of them was the greatest. He sat down, called the 12 disciples over to him, and said, "Whoever wants to be first must take last place and be the servant of everyone else." Then he put a little child among them. Taking the child into his arms, he said to them, "Anyone who welcomes a little child like this on my behalf welcomes me, and anyone who welcomes me welcomes not only me, but also my Father who sent me." John said to Jesus, "Teacher, we saw someone using your name to cast out demons." But he told him to stop because he wasn't in our group. "Don't stop him," Jesus said. "No one who performs a miracle in my name will soon be able to speak evil of me. Anyone who is not against us is for us. If anyone gives you even a cup of water because you belong to the Messiah, I tell you the truth, that person will surely be rewarded." In this text, before we get to our application, I want to highlight a few things. In the first section, it says that leaving the region, right? So where are they leaving? They're leaving Galilee. That's where they were doing ministry. They were getting ready to leave Galilee. They were getting ready to go to Jerusalem. Jesus is literally coming to the end of his ministry knowing that the cross is coming. And so they're going into Jerusalem, and so he says that he wants to be alone. He wants to, because there was multitudes of people following them around in Galilee, right? You guys know the stories. Really, the feeding of the 5,000, that was part of the multitude, right? There's a lot of people crowding around Jesus and his disciples, and in this moment, he decides that he's going to head to Jerusalem because he knows what's coming next, but he wants to be alone so he can have those final moments to share with the disciples, to teach them, to mentor them, to teach them, to disciple them, to pour into them. And so he tells them, the Son of Man is going to be betrayed in the hands of his enemies. He will be killed, but there's days later he will rise from the dead. But it says this, they were afraid to ask him what he meant. I'm going to pause there. Don't ever be afraid to ask somebody what they mean. Don't ever be afraid to ask someone a question, right? I'm sure you've heard it in elementary from your teachers. The only dumb question is not asking a question, right? Anybody ever heard that? Right? Don't be afraid to ask for clarification. Don't be afraid to ask when somebody says something to you or when they teach you about something. Don't be afraid to ask for clarification. Asking for clarification, asking to understand what they're presenting is not a sign of weakness. It's a sign of strength. It's a sign of humility. It's a sign of saying, man, I don't know it all, and I'm willing to ask. I don't know it all. I don't have all the answers. I don't have it all figured out, and so I'm willing to ask. And so you should be willing to ask for clarification when someone is teaching you something. After that, they arrived at Capernaum, settled in a house, and Jesus asked them what they were discussing on the road. And so apparently they were having a conversation as they were walking from Galilee to a house on the way to Jerusalem. And Jesus asked them, what were you discussing on the road? What were you talking about? Jesus wanted to know. He already knows because he's God. But he asked them. And what was their response? Kind of like right now. Silence. Silence. Probably, possibly because out of shame. Because they had just been arguing about who was the greatest. The disciples knew that Jesus was the Messiah. The Messiah, according to Jewish people, was supposed to be this king who would come in and have and establish his kingdom. And they had an earthly concept in mind. And so they're arguing about who's going to be at the right hand of the king of the world. So maybe it was out of shame. Maybe also it was out of understanding in that what Jesus was actually teaching them was starting to sink into their hearts. They felt conviction in that moment when Jesus asked because what they had been hearing from Jesus was finally starting to sink in. It was finally starting to take root in their heart. So whether it was out of shame or whether it was out of learning, either way, they were silent for a moment. But they didn't answer because they had been arguing about which of them was the greatest. And then Jesus sits down. I love this part. Because in the Bible, Old Testament, New Testament, when a rabbi, which is who Jesus was to the disciples, he was their teacher, when a rabbi would sit down, it meant that he was getting ready to teach them. It meant that he was getting ready to express to them something that they needed to learn. Right? In our context, it might be standing on a stage or standing up here, but in that context, when a teacher would sit down, everyone sat down and leaned in. And they were focused on what the rabbi was going to say. Because if you had committed 3 years of your life to following this guy, obviously you had value in what he had to teach. And so Jesus sits down because he's getting ready to teach them something. He calls the 12 disciples over to him and he says, whoever wants to be first must take last place and be the servant of everyone else. And this totally shifts human perspective because to be the greatest, to be the best, what does that mean? That means that you have to outwork, outcompete, outstrengthen, outthink everybody around you. right? That's what the world teaches, is that I need to outdo everyone around me to be the greatest. But Jesus says, whoever wants to be first must take last place and be a servant of everyone else. And he puts a little child, and he holds him and uses the child as an example. And then later in the text, John said to Jesus, "Teacher, we saw someone using your name to cast out demons," but he told him to stop because he wasn't in our group. And so there's 3 application points that I got out of this text today. And the first one, if you're taking notes, is the road to greatness begins with a small group. The road to greatness begins with a small group. Jesus and the disciples left the multitude. They left the masses of people. And they went alone as a small group into Jerusalem from Galilee. On the way, Jesus took the opportunity to share his heart with them. They went from a multitude and being surrounded by people and all this stuff going on to a small group. There's people not here tonight. We're a little bit smaller than normal. That's okay. Jesus changed the world with 12 people. There's over 24 of us in here. Think about what he could do if we all got on board with what he wanted to do in our lives. Google, anybody ever heard of them? Apple, Amazon, Microsoft, Dell, Mattel, Walt Disney. Mattel is the #1 toy manufacturer in the world. They make Hot Wheels, they make Barbies, they make every toy you can think of just about. Google, Apple, Amazon, Microsoft, Dell, Mattel, Walt Disney. Guess what? All of these organizations started with a small group of people meeting in a garage. Every one of these organizations that you and I know as household names, that most of us have benefited from, that most of us use on a regular basis, they all started with a small group of people in a garage. Oftentimes, we are called to leave the masses for something smaller. Don't be afraid to leave the big group. Don't be afraid to leave the popular thing in order to do something different. Because it takes a small group of people who are committed to something to change the world. Apple is one of the biggest manufacturers of stuff in our world. How many of you guys have an iPhone? Most of you. If you don't, you're wrong. Just saying. Android people, see ya. Windows, whatever else there is. Apple's the only way to go. Y'all ruin group chats, I'm just saying. But here's the deal. All of these organizations start with a small group. In the same way, Jesus calls us to leave the masses and join a small group. That's part of the biggest points of the church, is to be a part of a small group. When we have small group nights and you guys get the opportunity to discuss the message or talk about life, like that should be an opportunity for you to potentially connect with each other and change the world. Because the road to greatness begins with a small group. It does not begin with a lone wolf. It does not begin with someone who thinks that they can achieve everything in this life by themselves, that they can achieve Christianity by themselves. There's people that think they're a Christian, but they never go to church. I hate to tell you, you don't have to go to church to be a Christian, but if you're a Christian, you're going to go to church. Because that's where you're going to grow in a small group. That's where you're going to have mentors. That's where you're going to have discipleship. That's where things are going to take place and change in your life. Because if you're doing it alone, what happens to a nose when it's cut off? What happens to a hand when it's cut off? It dies. It's the same thing. The road to greatness begins with a small group. The second thing, the road to greatness is serving. The road to greatness is service, servanthood, serving. The disciples were arguing about who would be the greatest among them, who would sit at the right hand of Jesus when he ruled. Because they still had in mind that he was going to be a king, that he was going to take Jerusalem back from the Romans, that he was going to establish a kingdom, and he would sit on the throne, and he will someday, but they expected it then, and they expected it on earth physically. And so the disciples are arguing who's going to be the greatest, who's going to be his right hand, who's going to be his chief executive assistant, right? Or the VP to the president, or the, I don't know, what is a prime minister? Prime minister is top, right? I don't know. Y'all get the illustration, right? They were arguing about who was going to be second, who was going to rule in second place, who was the greatest, who had achieved enough to become the greatest in Jesus' eyes, the greatest disciple. They were arguing about it. And it was something they argued about regularly. It was something they talked about often. This passage is a mirror into our own lives. This passage is meant to be a mirror into our own life. We're just like the disciples. To hold up a mirror to you and I's life, to our life, and see the reflection and the similarities between us and the disciples. Listen, we have been called to be great. Each of you in here have been called to be great. But the pathway to greatness is not power and position. The pathway to greatness is servanthood. The pathway to greatness is not power and position. The pathway to greatness is servanthood. Paul David Tripp said that in his book that I'm reading right now. The pathway to greatness is not power and position. It's the pathway to greatness is servanthood. It's, are you serving people? Because what happens is, and this is what happened to the disciples, your default mode is to worship yourself. It's to be about you. To be, I want to be the greatest because I want to be the greatest. Now I want to be the greatest so that Jesus can be the greatest in my life. Every one of us in here struggles with our own idolatry. We worship ourselves. When you're hungry, you eat. Sometimes you eat more than you need to. When you're sad, you do whatever. When you're happy, you do whatever. When you receive pleasure from something, you do it over and over. Each of us in here struggles with the idolatry of self. That is your first idolatry. Idolatry is putting anything above God. I'm getting ready to end because I want to make sure we have time for small groups. Mark 10:45, what's it say?
Dang, Johnny.
Johnny's like that. On the
For even, I knew you had it, that's why I put it in here. For even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. The road to greatness is serving, servanthood. It's about putting others above yourself. The third and final point is the road to greatness is not a VIP club. The road to greatness is not a VIP club. In the verses that we read in Mark chapter 9, John tells Jesus that someone was doing something in Jesus' name, that they were casting out demons in his name. And they told him to stop because he didn't belong to their group. Someone was doing something in Jesus' name, and one of the disciples tells that person to stop because they weren't part of the disciples' group. Listen, greatness begins in a small group, but it is not a VIP club. Pastor Steve, myself, I've adopted the saying, is originally his, is probably someone else's, I don't know. We need to what? Keep our circle open. Right? Keep our circle open. The church is universal. Everyone that claims to be a Christian or a follower of Christ should be included by other followers of Christ. They shouldn't be shunned. They shouldn't be left out. They shouldn't be looked at differently. They should be included. Because the road to greatness is not a VIP club. It's not a closed group. It's not your group of friends and nobody else. And so in this text, we learn that the road to greatness begins with a small group. The road to greatness is serving, and the road to greatness is not a VIP club. We got about 15 minutes here. We're going to break up into small groups. and I want you guys to discuss the message, and then we'll come back here at 8:30. All right? All right.